Everyone that understands history and theory and psychology knows this is the case. So this is not a mystery. It's not poorly documented. It's unbelievably well documented. There's an entire history here. And the field, then shifts over to methods and then pretends that methods equal science. Okay, that's not right. All right. Methods are used as a tool to understand reality. The periodic table of the elements in chemistry and in physics, that's like our knowledge. And we use the methods of science to get knowledge about atoms and molecules. We don't know what we mean by mind, and that's amazing. So yeah, they get the methods, they institutionalize the methods, and we lose track of the ontology, the subject matter. They provide the meta-theoretical structure that gives us coherence, both in terms of relationship to vision logic, but then all the key insights that science has given us, evolutionary, neuroscience, the cognitive approaches, the behavioral approaches, and everything else that has afforded us. And the nice thing about these things is they grab all those insights and weave them together in a tapestry. So we now have a meta-theoretical causal framework for understanding this stuff. That's right. It's not magic at all. It's actually unbelievably conservative. UTOK, people will look at it, it's like, oh, that guy's a quack. He's claiming all this shit. I'm like, no, I'm claiming just foundational endo-naturalism. I'm like the fundamental assumptions of natural philosophy that virtually everybody made from Newton to Kant when they started on this. This just clarifies it. That's all. And it does it very conservatively, actually. It just takes all the key insights and just ties them together. And it says one of the epistemological criteria we should be having, and we sort of do, but we lost it because we decided we couldn't have it, is coherence. It's like, hey, is there comprehensive intelligibility here? And everyone, my discipline itself worked on that for a while and then said, but you're never going to have it. So then they denied it and then rationalized why they would never have it. And then we stopped looking for it. And to me, that's sort of like, almost might as well not do science. If you can't also achieve coherent intelligibility, then the whole project is really debatable in terms of its utility.
It's no secret that psychology has a unification problem. There are all these different parts, the theoretical ones to the therapeutic ones, that function really well on their own, but don't fit together into a coherent whole. Gregg Henriques has one of the most ambitious and impressive solutions to this problem. He's come up with a unified theory of knowledge, one that strings together all the different parts of psychology into a coherent, ontological picture. And his framework has a whole lot of consequence, not just for the field of psychology or the study of the mind, but also for scientific ontology in general. Gregg Henriques is a professor of psychology at James Madison University. He's the author of the 2011 book, A New Unified Theory of Psychology, as well as an upcoming one on the problem of psychology. He also runs a YouTube channel, UTOKing with Gregg, that is a great resource for understanding parts of his theory, as well as interesting conversations with other thinkers. Here, we try to do a deep dive into the key points and some of the finer details of his framework. Here is my conversation with Gregg Henriques.
Okay, so to start off, I think I would just want to talk about the problem of psychology. What is this problem of this fragmented nature of psychology, and how did you come across it?
To me, I'm really glad you're starting here. I wish that people understood this problem more. I think it's at the center of many different things. So the way I like to frame it is to say, hey, when physics got started, there was a lot of confusion about exactly how to define matter and motion. Although physicists were pretty clear that what they were interested was that topic. And then you get Newton comes along and he transforms a pre-paradigmatic set of insights into a full paradigm. Okay. And we get the real articulation and architecture of modern empirical science with Newton. And what you have is a very clear analysis, mathematical, experimental, theoretical of sort of classic matter in motion. Okay. And so we have a science of physics that's very clear about what its subject matter is. Chemistry emerges in relationship to that, biology in terms of its science of life, and a lot of other natural sciences then grow around this structure. Okay. In the middle of the 19th century, the success of modern empirical natural science naturally then draws people to start to think seriously about the mind, consciousness, human intelligence capacities, etc., And what you get is you get an emergence of we're going to apply the methods of science to psychology. Okay. But something very interesting happens shortly after this, within the first 50 years. And that is, there is no way that individuals can agree on the domain of the mental, okay, in a way that they can agree on the domain of the living or the domain of the material. So we get the physical and chemical sciences being pretty clear about, the word I'll use is their ontology. That is the thing in the world that they're about. Okay. Biologists come along and they can place their interest in the world scientifically in a pretty clear ontology. No one really debates that biology is the science of life. And although there's differences in opinion about what exactly constitutes life and the ingredients that go into it, everyone knows that a bacterial cell's alive. They know that viruses are interesting in that regard, and they know that a molecule is not alive. And then there's the world of the living, and the science of biology is the world of the living, okay? And you bring the methods of science to understand ontologically what life is and how it works, okay? Then you get to psychology. It has no subject matter. What do you mean by that? Didn't you just say it was about mind? And it's like, yeah, but we don't define mind in any way like we define life and matter, because we don't know what our referent is, and everybody's got different kinds of reference, and no one can agree on how to put all the reference together to give you a coherent whole. Okay. So what happened to the field of psychology is that it started to grow in different schools of thought, actually very similar to the way Newton's pre-Newton physics was. Okay. But then what happened is that they never put the system together, and instead was like, well, you'll never will put the system together. What we're a science of is we're a science because we apply the methods of science to whatever the mental is. Okay. So by the middle of the 20th century, 19 in America, we get this emergence of the science of psychology is the science of behavior and mental process, where behavior was what's available to us via the scientific method, and mental processes are what maps, the researcher maps as what they think is the cause or a mediating input-output relation. This is now in mainstream psychology. Radical behaviors are different. So the bottom line is, there is no agreement about what we mean by mind or mental process. That's a miracle. That's like, oh my, what do you, really? Like, we don't know what we mean. And the answer is, yeah, that we don't know what we mean. And that's amazing.
One of the quotes from I think the second chapter of your book that really stuck out to me was, I forget which psychologist it was that said it, but it was essentially that psychology had its institutionalization before it had its content, and its methods before it had its problems.
That's right. Sigmund Koch.
Thank you. And that just seems to be a novel and kind of remarkable historical development. Like, how does that work?
Right. But what the interesting thing is, everyone that understands history and theory and psychology knows this is the case. So this is not a mystery. It's not poorly documented. It's unbelievably well documented. There's an entire history here. And the field, then shifts over to methods and then pretends that methods equal science. Okay. That's not right. All right. Methods are used as a tool to understand reality. The periodic table of the elements in chemistry and in physics, that's like our knowledge. And we use the methods of science to get knowledge about atoms and molecules. We don't know what we mean by mind, and that's amazing. So yeah, they get the methods, they institutionalize the methods, and we lose track of the ontology, the subject matter. And that's in my current book that I just finished. I got to just get through the reference and submit. It's called The Problem of Psychology and a New Vision for Its Solution. I take the analysis I did in my first book and deepen it at a philosophical level even further, and articulate the proper philosophical solution, meaning the metaphysical and ontological solutions that then set the stage for a meta-theoretical solution, which I outlined in that first book quite explicitly.
Right. So is part of this because psychology is unique in that it has these competing interests? I think you talk about values in one of the chapters, these competing interests between a therapeutic application and the theoretical side of it. Like even going back to Vygotsky, there's this sort of separation between a rational explication and phenomenal experience.
Totally. So psychology becomes this hub of different facets that can't get defined. So lots of things get attached to it. So there are a number of different problems that never get resolved, and then everything gets amalgamated just into an incoherent institutional arrangement. Okay, so let's break some of those down. So one is inside of science. Okay, we have the problems inside of science. So I said science comes along and defines its subject matter, but it does through sort of particular epistemological frame, meaning science learns how to know about the world a particular way. Okay, I argue that actually what science does is it builds the concept of behavior philosophically. Okay, and what that means is behavior means you pull out an entity relative to a field, then you measure that change. Okay, and then you develop data and logical analysis and experimentation on behavior, which means that you situate your scientific observer in a place where he or she's gathering measurement about change and developing models, correspondent models to change. Okay. Now, why is that really important? Well, it's really important because many people believe that the subject matter of psychology is something what I would call the psyche. Okay. But the psyche is different than behavior because psyche sits inside of the system and is in what's called inside out epistemic vector, meaning your psyche. I can't see your psyche directly. You have access to the world through your psyche, but I don't observe your psyche. I only observe your behavior. Okay. So the nature of the scientific enterprise is behavioral. The language of it is behavioral. But the interest of us in psychology is, at least in part, the subjective experience of being in the world that you can't see behaviorally. Okay, so inside of science, you got this real conundrum. You're like, well, we're gonna make this thing a science, and one of our interests can't be scientifically observed based on the language of science and how it justifies relative to what the subject matter is. So inside the field, this is just one of the major problems why, we start with Wilhelm Wundt saying, hey, I'll do this by training introspectionists to get access to phenomenological consciousness, and then they blow up that method. There's good historical debate about whether that's a good thing to do or not, but that's the issue. You can't get at it directly, okay? So early on, this is the scientific issue. And when psychology, the modern science of psychology, is getting underway, it's inside the science problem. So it's not spread to the point that you're making. However, pretty early on, people are like, well, we got psychiatry over here in medicine, right? There was all this mental illness problems. So that by 1906, clinical psychology is starting to get established, okay? And it's a small discipline at first, but in the United States, after World War II, the wealth of the United States government was in a position, after all the boys came home, okay, they poured a huge amount of money into psychology to help with adjustment, okay? So then you had, and the psychologists have been developing technologies like to assess people and develop measurement constructs about intelligence and psychopathology, and had started the process, and psychoanalysis and behaviorism were both doing this, started the process to say we can start applying this knowledge to make the world a better place, help with human well-being. Well, then the United States government invested a huge amount of money and said, hey, psychologists, help with adjustment, okay? So all of a sudden what happened then is clinical psychology was born in 1947. There's a Boulder model. Notice that's right after World War II, okay? And then the field starts to give this identity of, hey, we're psychological doctors. And actually society in the 1970s, certainly United States society, took off at the level of, hey, we need mental health. And so then if more and more people piled into mental health, the science of psychology was already fluffy at the level of its subject matter. And then you had the influx of applied people. And this just then added layers of complexity, so much so that now when most people think of a psychologist, they don't think about a scientist doing lab-based research. They think about somebody you go talk to about your mother, you know, you know, so, and then, so what is the identity of a psychologist? Then they license a psychologist. There was actually in the United States, there's ways in which, if you're just a professor of psychology, you can't really call yourself a psychologist, because then you licensed it, because that became a health service profession under license regulation. So there's all of this identity confusion. I want to make clear that the identity of a professional psychologist is fundamentally different than the identity of a scientist in the goals that that they're operating to achieve. A scientist wants to describe and explain. A professional psychologist wants to affect change toward well-being, and all those things can be paired up in some ways. They fundamentally are different. So the unified theory ultimately says actually psychology needs to be divided into three great branches: the profession, and then there are two domains of mental process that must be separated: the animal mental domain of process, which I can talk about, and then the culture person domain. Those are two very different domains of mental process. And because we cluster everything together in mental process, don't have ways of differentiating it, we get enormous amounts of confusion.
Okay, so before we pull in the TOK system, let's talk about the Enlightenment gap. So you trace this back to Western intellectual history and a problem that occurs, well, in Descartes specifically, but has its traces to classical philosophy, as does everything. So what is the Enlightenment gap?
Right. So the Enlightenment gap. So basically, when science emerges, it grabs a hold of a clear new knowledge system, essentially physics, chemistry into physics, and it gives rise to a physically reductive view of the world. Okay, in the sense that we can now stratify the layers of nature, at least starting with biology into chemistry into physics. Okay, and show the laws of physics manage the matter in motion behavioral process. Okay. But what we couldn't do then is then place the emergence of a human knower, okay, in relationship to that, understand what human consciousness is, understand what consciousness is, understand what intelligence is, understand the relationship between a knower and the known in a holistic way. Okay. So especially in the sort of British to American tradition, you can argue that somebody like Hegel, who did develop a pretty interesting synthesis, was pretty successful at potentially getting a synthetic philosophy. Of course, it lasts for 50 years or so inside of the German academy. It then breaks down. I don't think that anywhere you see a real synthetic philosophy holding, but that becomes a different German idealist tradition. What happens to the British is an empiricist tradition that I like to say gets stuck between the epistemology of Kant and the ontology of Newton. And what I mean by that is we get a physical, the world is clearly matter in motion. You lose the philosophical justification for what's called dual worldism, or a dual worldview, which is Rene Descartes, this idea that there's matter and there's mind, and mind is a different substance. Okay, almost everybody blows that up and says, actually, philosophically, metaphysically, the concepts and categories of these two fundamentally different things can't work together. You really can only make sense out of the world as a one worldism, especially as the emergence of science. So this is all the backdrop. What's the Enlightenment gap? Well, the failure of this means that we have a massive mind-matter, mind-body problem. Like, what is the proper relationship between what is mind? How does it fit in the material universe? What is it in terms of both consciousness, and then how do we know? Okay. So that's one gigantic part of the Enlightenment gap, a gap in our knowledge that places mind in proper relationship to matter. A second aspect of it is, well, what actually is scientific knowledge, and how do we build a system of scientific knowledge that's held in proper relationship to subjective and social knowledge? The dimension here is you can really see the tensions between modernism, which is like, oh, science gives us a transcendent way of understanding reality. Postmodernism saying, no, science really is a justification system. That's my term, but that's essentially what they say it as, that situates in socio-historical context and ultimately legitimizes white male logic, okay, in many regards, to create a power colonial structure that legitimizes the structures of the liberty and democracy and everything else of modernity, and actually is a disaster for many others, and isn't shouldn't be granted any kind of special authority relative to regular cultural knowledge. It's not a coherent worldview. It can't be said to give a grand narrative. It needs to be contextualized. And so the postmodern critique says, no, you have to contextualize science. You can't justify it as some transcendent knowing systems. And so you get this problem. The Enlightenment gap is then the confusion, the chaotic, fragmented pluralism that emerges out of our failure to develop a philosophy that coherently synthesizes mind and matter and the proper relationship of science relative to social and subjective knowledge. And if we then agree that, yeah, philosophy, we never got a philosophical picture of placing science in relationship to social and subjective knowledge, and we don't know matter to mind, well, with that backdrop, you then enter into this whole, well, how are we going to develop a science of mind? Okay. And now all of a sudden you're at the foot of the problem of psychology. Well, of course, if we lack a conceptual structure to answer these two questions, inevitably the problem of psychology would arise as it starts to get institutionalized. And that's exactly what happened. And this is what really situates UTOK. So in 2011, when I wrote that book, that's a new unified theory of psychology, where I'm arguing that there is a way to see the world that delineates, gives us a vocabulary, a conceptual map, and a meta-theoretical structure that allows us to see how psychology can actually be seen as a coherent scientific discipline, okay? But actually, the way in which I saw that was actually embedded or in a larger problem, a foundational philosophical problem that arises with science and breaks our knowledge systems. So now the current framework that I developed is called UTOK, which is Unified Theory of Knowledge, and is actually situated to say, hey, we can actually solve the Enlightenment gap, which also then grounded then in the solution to the problem of psychology. So it's a huge deal in relationship to kind of really a fundamental shift in the grammar of our knowledge systems to get in right relation, matter and mind, and the nature of science relative to social and subjective knowledge. We don't have that at all. I argue UTOK is really the first system that's going to afford us the capacity to get coherent there.
It's not just a problem of psychology. Psychology happens to be particularly important to us and in the ways that it's fragmented. But the problem is of how science develops in general and how we should.
Well, right. And how to understand scientific knowledge coherently, what it says about the universe, and place your subjective quality experience of being, place wisdom and values in relationship to that. And so the short answer is that science emerged, but it fragmented off psyche and wisdom. Okay. And UTOK puts together a coherent picture of science with psyche and wisdom for the first time. So it gives us a post-science coherent synthetic philosophy that organizes science's relationship to psyche and relationship to wisdom. And that's exciting. We clearly don't have that.
So could you define psyche a little bit further? I've always kind of just thought of it as the domain of phenomenological subjective experience, all those things that we don't have good tools to understand.
Right. So the specific definition of psyche that I use, okay, is the unique, particular, idiographic perspective and experience of being of each individual in the now. Okay. So your psyche, is your experience of being conscious, phenomenologically, qualitatively conscious in the now. Now notice, I didn't just say consciousness. I said each idiographic, unique, particular experience of being in the here and now. Okay. Why did I say all those words? It's not just like I like to have multisyllabic words. I'm actually using them for purpose. What you notice with those words, if you pay attention to them, okay, unique, idiographic, particular, in the real, subjective, qualitative, they're exactly the opposite words that science generates. Okay, science is about a generalizable view of general processes that gives causal explanatory frameworks of the generative mechanisms of what gives rise to the actual empirical realities that we can observe from the outside in an intersubjective, objective way. So science gives rise to a language game, to use a Wittgensteinian term, to justify the world in a way that's completely antithetical to the psyche. Okay. And so what then then the science got so dominant, it's like, well, we just got to get rid of the psyche and we will just explain mechanistically the whole. And the answer is no, you actually, your language game in metaphysics, define it out initially. Okay. That's the nature of the language game you're playing. So if the language game you're playing is, you can't then just say, oh, it doesn't matter. You just have to know your justification plays by these rules and legitimizes the world a particular way. Okay. UTOK says, yeah, that's not a bad, but it's a limited epistemological structure that then needs to find its way into yoking itself back together with the psyche. Okay. And UTOK gives the tree of knowledge actually to map the science perspective, which then I'm saying psychology actually fits in the science perspective. And then I have a thing called the I-quad coin, which is then part of the whole garden. The I-quad coin is a psycho-architectural technology that captures the unique human identity function of each of us. And then it's placing the coin in relationship to the tree gives us a metaphysical structure that places the idiographic psyche in connection with the scientific nomothetic perspective of behavior. And that relationship has never been achieved before. And the reason I'm able to do it is because I built a unified theory of psychology. And really, the unbelievable conceptual difficulty is building a theory that holds these two together. That's the mind-matter problem in many ways, or at least it's an epicenter of it. And UTOK solves that, and then it shows you how to hold these two perspectives together. So it bridges science and psyche.
Okay, so maybe a good idea to just introduce TOK. Yes, so just, do you mind just introducing a little bit for people listening?
Absolutely. So in 1997, I was stoned one day. I go back to 1997. Woo-hoo. Yes, and I actually, I use this for creative, outside the box thinking. But anyway, in 1996, I had come across this idea of justification. Okay. And what is justification? Justification actually is what turns us from primates into persons. Okay. You're both a primate and you're a person. Okay. What do I mean by a person? A person is an entity that is self-consciously aware, can reflect on why they do what they do, give accounts to other people for why they do what they do on your historical stage, and take responsibility for what you do going forward. That's what a person is. Okay. You get socialized to become a person. It's a particular capacity, and you're socialized through it to the process of justification, okay, which is a propositional language network that tells you, hey, this is what you are, and this is how you do what you do, and why, and this is what's legitimate. And then you build a little model of that, and that becomes your ego, and you manage that on your persona, and you live in what's called the culture person plane. Okay, that makes sense? Okay. But you also are a perceiving, acting creature that, shits and pisses and eats and does all the things that animals do. You're still an animal, a specific kind of animal called a primate. Okay. So people forget that, but you're both a person and a primate. And I was then seeing the dynamics of persons through this lens of justification. Then what happened, I was stoned, I was like, well, if persons come out of animal mind here, and then I saw animal mind comes out of organism's life, and then organismic life comes out of inanimate matter, and inanimate matter comes out of energy. Okay. And in that moment, I then had a picture of energy to matter, matter to life, life to mind, mind to culture. And then that created a taxonomy of the behavior of the things inside of that. Energy actually stores information, and then matter gives rise to the objects on the behavior, and that's like Newton studied. And then you get living organisms like Darwin analyzed, and then you get mental animals. Okay, that's crucial. And then you get cultured persons. So you now have information, objects, organisms, animals, and persons nested in energy, matter, life, mind, culture fields. And with that taxonomy, okay, now it's not mind versus matter versus mind. It's energy, matter, life, mind, culture. Okay. And there's a particular kind of relationship between those kinds of categories. And the tree of knowledge maps those relations. And once you see that, at least this is my experience, like, oh, this creates a scientific view. And what it does is it differentiates animals from organisms from below, and then persons from primates into animals from above. And then with that category, you realize, oh my gosh, the behaviorists, they're doing animal mental stuff. Okay. And then the human psychologists are all doing justification. And then I actually argued that I call the joint points, like to get from life to mind, and then from mind to culture, there are these processes of complexity building. I argued that B.F. Skinner actually saw a huge part of the process by which living organisms would give rise to really mentally behaving animals. And then Sigmund Freud's key insights about how our ego, superego relative to our id, and our tensions between our socialized lives and our animal lives really saw the core. His insights, his theories are a little shaky. His insights really saw the tension between persons and primates. Okay. And then I was able to map theoretically Skinner's key insights then to life and mind, and then Freud's key insights. And then we would have Skinner and Freud aligned on a physical, psychosocial field system that was coherent and could place our knowledge structures across these dimensions of complexification in a full, understandable, and intelligible package.
So there are emergent information processing systems that are connected by these joint point theories. So let's just talk for a second about emergence and reduction. I think this provided a whole lot of clarity when dealing with those questions. So at each level, there is genuine emergence in the sense that there is novel causality at each level. Is that the claim?
To understand emergence, you have to break it up into what's called weak, and some people don't like the term strong. There's a history here, but actually the specific is, if you look at the tree of knowledge diagram, which I think you show, you're going to see there's an evolution of matter, and there's a cone of matter, and then there's a cone of life, cone of mind, cone, and this is on a dimension of complexification. Okay. Now, what's important to realize then is that there's emerging complexification within the dimension of matter. Okay. It goes all the way down to energy, and we can trace that. So you get particles, and then atoms, and then molecules, and then you get aggregate scale stuff happening, meaning particles can all get together, and then they create gas structures or whatever. Usually they're nucleons and atoms and whatever. But you can get the point that you get stars, and you get galaxies, solar systems, things like that. So what you are there is you have what many people is called everyday weak emergence. Okay, so weak emergence is absolutely, everyone agrees that if you get a bunch of parts together, they create aggregate patterns. Those aggregate patterns influence others, and really, there's almost everyone agrees you got to kind of explain stuff, at least according to our human limitations. You got to kind of explain stuff at the aggregate level. Okay, so chemistry has to have a vocabulary that's different than particle physics. Now, there's good reduction arguments within the dimensions that basically says, yeah, but it's really the understanding the aggregate behavior of the parts that is fundamental, and thus a good physical reductionist argument can be made, yeah, but chemistry essentially reduces to particle physics. Okay, and many physicists then take that, or what I would call sort of physical reductionists, take that line of argument and just say, well, that's the whole thing. It's really the four fundamental forces of electromagnetism, gravity, strong and weak nuclear, give rise to the standard theory. That's the core theory. These are the only core causes that we know of in the world. They give rise to aggregate patterns interacting. You go on up the scale from physics, chemistry, biology. Okay. UTOK says, no, you made a mistake there. When you jump from chemistry to biology, okay, you weren't going just up a level. It wasn't like going from particles to atoms to molecules. When you got to genes and cells, something else was going on. Okay. And it doesn't show just a general single cone of complexification. That's within a level. It shows a fundamental jump. Okay. Now, what is that jump? I spent a hell of a lot of time figuring out. So I'm stoned. I pop out this vision logic. And then I'm like, what the hell did I actually draw? Okay. Well, actually, what that represents is the emergence of a new complex adaptive plane of existence, okay, that is then negentropically organized, meaning that it creates work effort to create a systemic, autopoietic, self-organizing structure that I believe is properly construed as being tied together by information processing and communication networks, okay? Now, information processing and communication networks, I argue, to be fundamentally novel epistemic processes in the world that absolutely cannot be reduced to the four fundamental forces. Okay. And this is what you actually do, get a causal jump, so that the connection between stuff gives rise to another causal process, in this case, information processing and communication between cells, that has nothing like it in the inanimate plane and emerges as a self-organizing system that can't be reduced to its parts. And this then is a jump in dimensional complexification. It's a novel kind of emergence. Okay, creates a complexity building feedback loop, and then it's stored information and I can explain why information processing cannot be reduced to its parts. But that's the essence of it. So life then, and then mind and culture, are each planes of existence that give rise to new dimensions of complexification beyond, as a function of information processing and communication networks.
Right. So maybe the terms of strong and weak emergence might just not be good descriptors, which I'm starting to think that's the case.
Yeah, they got a history to them. So it's within level, within dimension, that gives rise to levels. And in fact, I built a thing called the periodic table of behavior off the tree of knowledge that says, yes, here are the levels. And there are actually primary and aggregate levels, but I delineate primary levels as there's the primary whole at the material level is an atom, and you get particles. You see the periodic table of the elements mapping the atoms, the standard theory of elementary particle physics mapping the particles. Then you get the map of all the molecules. Then you just do that across scale. You jump up, you get genes, cells, and multi-celled organisms. You get neural networks, animals and animal groups. You get justifications, persons, and groups of persons. What that does is it gives you within level development of, within dimension level development, and then between dimension. And then you see it's a two-axis system of, oh, there are within level dimensions of emergence that are pretty common. Everyone kind of agrees with those kinds of things, not really super hard to understand. But then there's these jumps in dimensions. People are confused about that. And yeah, I think the argument that new epistemic processes, is absolutely crucial to understand, and that is a fundamentally novel causal process in the world.
Right. Yeah. So there's complexification within a plane, but also there's just so much of a novel jump between each plane especially when you have a autopoietic system that's optimizing for negentropy, that you just can't use the tools of the level below it to describe it. It just is hopeless.
Exactly.
But I think that's so often when strong emergence is evoked, I think something more is meant ontologically. Like we go towards panpsychism or something where something is snuck in.
That freed systems up,
right.
Then get into metaphysical ontological confusions. The vision of the tree of knowledge is very clear, and essentially what most people mean from physical reduction. No, it's one world, one dimension of complexification at one level of looking at it. But this distinction to get it right is, there is this novel jump of dimension plane. And that's why living organisms are fundamentally different than animate, mental and cultural. And then you get, it's language information processing communication networks, especially once you understand why those are fundamentally different than physical causation, you really do get a nice picture.
And I think if you press anyone on the details of it, they have to accept it at some point. Like there's just no way. You can say in a hand-wavy way that you can reduce behavior to fundamental forces, but you can't. You just can't.
You can't. Part of the reason, is because each of us are as information processing systems. What I do is I create a schematic of you, and it's the generalized schematic of you that I'm fitting using Bayesian analysis, if you want to get technical, about what my hypothesis of your form is. And then I grab a hypothesis of your form, and then I act that you're the form that fits this. Now notice, if I pull out a generalized abstraction of you and use that form to inform me about the way I think about you,
right.
The particle that make up your thing now is completely abstracted, lost. I don't pull the microscopic analysis of your parts in that form at all. I simply pull the abstraction that I make off of it. And it is that abstraction that then fits into my information processing system, not the infinite tiny little particle quantum states that make up the whole. It's the macroscopic form pulled off the whole that actually creates the information epistemic process. And that clearly has causal impact. And so once that has obvious causal impact, now you're like, yes, no, things are abstracting the macroscopic off the microscopic. So now the microscopic is no longer causal. It's the macroscopic form that's causal in epistemic systems. And then you're like, well, shit, I mean, if that's happening, then there's no way you can possibly do a physically reductive argument. You're done. And the answer is, yeah, you're done when epistemic processes emerge, which they do at life, mind, and culture. That's why you need another dimension. That's why the vision logic of the tree of knowledge is so compelling. It's like, oh, it's within it at some level, but also above it at another level. Getting clear about how it's both within and above is one of the philosophical conundrums that we struggled with, and that there are actually 3 layers of them also struggled. Tree of knowledge tells you what the vision logic is, tells you why there are 3 layers, and gives clarity.
And I mean, not just the vision logic, that's why the language of UTOK is so
Well,
helpful. Because, I mean, like you said earlier, one of the problems in psychology was thinking, well, thinking is the science of behavior. Well, then what is behavior? Everything is the science of the behavior of something. Well, if we can narrow this down to what we're talking about ontologically to be the behavior of, namely when it comes to life, the behavior of this specific information processing system, defined by behavioral investment theory and how it behaves, well, then we have a clear language, and there's nothing spooky going on. There's no weird strong emergence going on. Everything is still naturally explained through causal mechanisms that can be, well, ontologically explainable by fundamental particle physics, but it still makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I agree. And certainly, obviously, I spent a huge amount of time trying to delineate the theoretical structure in behavioral investment theory, justification. They provide the meta-theoretical structure that gives us coherence, both in terms of relationship to vision logic, but then all the key insights that science has given us: evolutionary, neuroscience, the cognitive approaches, the behavioral approaches, and everything else that has afforded us. And the nice thing about these things is they grab all those insights and weave them together in a tapestry. So we now have a meta-theoretical causal framework for understanding this stuff. That's right. It's not magic at all. It's actually unbelievably conservative. You talk, people will look at it, it's like, oh, that guy's a quack. He's claiming all this shit. I'm like, no, I'm claiming just foundational endo-naturalism. I'm like, the fundamental assumptions of natural philosophy that virtually everybody made from Newton to Kant when they started on this. This just clarifies it. That's all. And it does it very conservatively, actually. It just takes all the key insights and just ties them together. And it says one of the epistemological criteria we should be having, and we sort of do, but we lost it because we decided we couldn't have it, is coherence. It's like, hey, is there comprehensive intelligibility here? And everyone, I mean, my discipline itself worked on that for a while and then said, but you're never going to have it. So then they denied it and then rationalized why they would never have it. And then we stopped looking for it. And to me, that's sort of like, I mean, almost might as well not do science. If you can't also achieve coherent intelligibility, then the whole project is really debatable in terms of its utility. At least.
Absolutely. I think if you wait long enough, science always comes back to coherence.
Totally. And I think that's my hope is, of course, the system is so institutionalized, different, but the hope is that people outside will be, of course, oh, yes, of course, there's animal, mental, and culture person, and they operate on different justifications. The idea that you would yoke them all together in mental process, not specify and give it up to the researcher just to develop a design and then tell you what the model is that doesn't interact with any other model necessarily, because everybody's doing mid-level research that gives rise to 6 billion different models about what psychology finds. And you're like, any person that's not inside the institution looks at that and that's just silly,
Right. I mean,
it's not the way we define knowledge.
I think that's how you end up with Mysterianism, or at least sociologically end up with people buying into Mysterianism, right?
Oh, of course. Because I mean, if there's a chaotic fragmented pluralism is the best that the system can offer, what the hell? I think that's a death knell to a knowledge system myself. And I'm really amazed at how much our system has just sort of fell into that without concern. And has lost its concern with it. So yeah, outside of that, mysticism, any number of different kind of beliefs.
I mean, I'd say even more prominently from the experience of undergraduate students, people coming into the field, I think people are often bound to one of the two things, where either someone just really takes one tradition up and guards their stick in the ground and says that's it, or people obviously recognize this problem but don't have a solution to it, so they just appeal to mystery or to just to some claim of not knowing.
Yep. And I think institutionally what essentially happens is the field then tries to crank out empirical findings. Okay, so there's this other thing, and we're just going to get a laundry list. Hey, have you seen the latest empirical findings? It's like, so okay, so it's just an endless laundry list of, well, let's do one more study and we'll try to find. So you get, all right, here's a paradigm I can relate to. I go psychoanalysis, go existentialism. Okay, here, screw this, I'm going to religious mystic. There's a lot of wisdom in the East. People wake up and be like, why don't we do Buddhism? I'm like, yeah, good suggestion. And then you also get this sort of rote generation of new findings that are, become fad research. None of those, in my estimation, are anywhere near as valuable as a coherent, intelligible understanding of the phenomenon.
Yeah, so that's something that surprised me. You came to this through a clinical background as well, right? Where a lot of people kind of just focus on the theory. You actually dealt with the actual application of it.
Right. That's so right. So in 1994, so I get trained as a good, empirical scientist, and I buy when I'm an undergraduate. I have this notion that it should make sense, but then it's like, oh, okay, and then I buy, oh, it's the scientific method, blah blah blah, and then I was under the impression that the scientific method had yielded the idea that certain approaches were better than others. So this is in the right in the late 1980s, where the cognitive and behavioral approaches were waving the flag that they were better than the other approaches, and that science had enabled them to make that justification. By the way, although I'm well-versed in all that, that's all bullshit, okay? I didn't realize it at the time, but I thought, so I was like, okay, I'm going to follow the science there. Then you get into the clinic room, and you also get knowledgeable about the way research is actually done and what was then unfolding at the time, which is called the dodo bird finding. It's actually all credible psychotherapies get the exact same basic, certainly in almost every generalized anxious depressed cluster. It's amazing how common the dodo bird finding is. Anyway, so you get all this generalized effects, okay? And then you get the fact that when you sit with somebody, okay, sit with the psyche, okay? I didn't have the term at the time, but it was like you enter into the world with the psyche, and then you get this whole idiographic, there are general categories like depression, but it's really this idiographic dance with a unique particular, okay? And you're like, my humanistic side gets pulled in very strong. So it's like, oh my God, but I'm totally a scientist. So I'm like, why can't I have a coherent science? I look at medicine's all fucked up, but they at least have Western medicines like, hey, physiology, anatomy, we can anchor this to human biology, and we know what human biology is. It's living processes that give rise to physiology and anatomy. They break down. We can study physiology and anatomy. We divide the systems up, and everyone's works out okay. I was like, hey, you have a bone problem, you see a generalist, and then you go to an orthopedic specialist. And nobody says, oh, the orthopedic specialist, that's the key to health. And I was like, no, that's a part of the system. So what I'm like, all of these insights make sense, but they should be grounded in the science. And that's when I went from my empirical training, and then I was like, but that's not help. What I really need, like biology is the science of life, I need to know what psychology is. And then in 1994, 1995, when I did that, I realized I needed a big picture view, and I found evolutionary psychology, which was just coming on the scene at the time. The adapted mind is a sort of the Bible of evolutionary psychology. That came out in 1992. Robert Wright had written a book called The Moral Animal in 1994. And I fell into that. I was like, oh, I didn't really learn evolutionary theory. And I really studied and taught myself evolutionary theory. And I was like, of course, this provides a big picture view. And so for 2 years, I was thinking evolutionary psychology was key. And then I stumbled across this justification idea. And then that really blew up evolutionary psychology. Okay. So ironically, because it's a totally evolutionary psych idea, but it actually blows up evolutionary psychology, even as an evolutionary idea. And it shows how limited evolutionary psychology really is. And that's when I shifted away from there and then backed into the tree of knowledge system, which at the time was in the framework, and it grows into UTOK itself, the unified theory of knowledge. But anyway, yeah, that was, so I started in the clinic room, and ultimately I returned through the garden. I actually returned to the proper holding. We talk about psyche and science, to the proper holding of a unique idiographic lateral perspective versus a generalized nomethetic perspective. The key is an epistemology that produces an ontology that coheres between those two perspectives, and that's what I figured out how to do.
No, that makes sense. I mean, no matter how robust the approaches to therapy might be, behavioral, cognitive, psychodynamic, like you mentioned, there just seems like there will always be variability in the way that the clinician applies it. Like, what's important is not the tradition that the clinician subscribes to. What's important is just the ability of the clinician to have clarity, have skill, have relationship.
Always. Yeah, it's exactly that's what they find. That you'll read Bruce Walpole, The Great Psychotherapy Debate, that affords a really empirical articulation of exactly your point. It's the skill of the practitioner to enter into the unique situation, read and participate in the unique situation well. Behaviorists are as inclined to be able to do that as others. And then you get massive within various effects of good therapists versus lousy therapists. So we get that everywhere. And you can say, oh yeah, there's good therapy and there's shitty therapy. And most people are average, not surprisingly. And there are a couple of master therapists. They go in with virtually anybody and work well with them. It's amazing. And there are about 10% are like shitty therapists. They take relatively healthy people and make them worse. So it's all within therapy, relational, participatory dynamics between the vast majority of it is a psychosocial relational dance process, not the technical language. I just did a podcast on this like 3 months ago. Not the technical language of the issue. It is the psychosocial relational dynamics that's accounting for almost all the variants. It's hard to put a figure on it, 95%, whatever, etc. But that's where the action.
Yeah, I mean, just pragmatically, that makes sense, right? I mean, you could be the most educated person in the world, but there's no way you can totally apply a theory in the clinic room, like it to the letter.
Totally. And actually, the more you do that, okay, we're actually pretty reactive, autonomous creatures. If we get the sense that we're being dropped into some algorithmic formula, that immediately activates us in particular kinds of ways. So the more refined and quasi-autistic you are, and especially, no offense, but in that regard, you're not going to read the participatory dynamics of the individual. 95%, there are some exceptions, who want to be seen as a unique individual and valued for their own uniqueness, are going to be then quite resistant to being placed in a preordained structure. And if you're really good at doing that, that's going to be potentially good reasons that would work against you actually in dancing with people. So yeah, there's a lot of consideration to be given there, and the school of thought approach, while it has some merit, if you can do better, it's
no. I mean, that's a really good point. Like anecdotally, I really find that to be true. Whenever just speaking with friends, general people who aren't psychologists or academics, whenever people get the feeling that someone's trying to apply a psychological frame to them, like it could be anything, it's trait theory, development, anything. Whenever people feel like they're being boxed in and it feels too inorganic, people get very defensive and find all kinds of ways to get out of it.
All good therapy begins with Rogers, okay, in my estimation. And Rogers did identify the core ingredients. You better have, I would call it foundational positive regard. He called it unconditional, but you better have foundational positive regard. You better have empathy, and you better want to be orient toward the organismic valuing process of the individual. Okay. And be very wary about any preordained judgment, because they'll react against it and it's going to disrupt the process anyway. So that is the beauty of humanistic approaches. And to me, if you're actually going to have, mandated therapy, there are a lot of other contexts that's weird, but in general, the first point you want to make is align with the psyche. Let the psyche's doing its organismic valuing process. And then if you're going to bring trait theory to bear or any of those types of things, you better have it aligned with the psyche. Or if you're going to be as the expert that's going to portray your knowledge of it, the person may submit to you and say, "Oh, this is so helpful."
Right.
Investment at all.
Right.
Totally.
Okay. So to trail back a little bit, let's talk about behavioral investment theory, the joint point between life and mind. How did you come up with behavioral investment theory? And could you just flesh it out a little bit for people?
Sure. Okay. So behavioral investment theory, right, is basically, it's a theory of what is the nervous system doing. Okay. And it's really at one level super simple. Okay. And it says, hey, what's the nervous system do? Well, many people call it the organ of behavior. Okay. As a man in neuroscience. What do they mean? Well, it sort of coordinates your activity. Okay. All right. And then you ask, well, how does it do that? Okay. And then you say, well, it seems to try to move you towards good things. Okay. It's got some valuation about what good and bad is. And you can see that in your own feeling. Pleasure and pain are pretty base feeling structures, right? Okay. That's good. That's a green light to that thing and red light to that thing. Okay. So it's getting you to do, it's got a value to make some difference. And then it's got input structures, sensory and perception input to detect what's out here. It's got interoception, which basically says, how am I doing? Am I hungry? Am I hurt? Okay. And it's got output structures that energize motion to regulate this flow. Okay. All right. And then what behavior investment theory says, yes. Okay. And what happens in the world of animals, okay, is that this dimension of coordinated movement emerges in the animal kingdom, different than fungi and plants, which are also super complicated and demonstrate a lot of biological intelligence that's complex at living, but they don't have centralized coordinated movement systems. Okay. This was in Aristotle, and all kids, by the way, identify birds and bees as behaving differently than plants and trees, flowers and trees. Okay. They behave as whole units that engage in sensory motor looping. Okay. Meaning that there's an input, organized motor output function, which we should call mindedness. Okay. And then the theory is, well, where does that come from? Okay. And behavioral investment theory gives you 6 meta principles. It says fundamentally what it is an investment value system. Okay. That now I can hook up with a guy by the name of John Vervaeke. Okay. And say, actually, yeah, okay. So he's got a framework for essentially the way information is processed called recursive relevance realization, which basically means the system is seeking relevance, like what's important, to realize its goals and then recursively evaluate them. Okay. And what I saw is it does that to cultivate paths of investment so that it creates around affordances and stressors to build resource acquisition around survival and reproductive success. And it does it on the principle of least effort, which means you want to expend the least amount of effort to get the most on your return. Okay. And so behavioral investment theory is this idea. It's an investment value system that's cultivating passive investment through now recursive relevance realization, what I used to call a neurocognitive process, but now we can specify. So that's the theory. It then organizes 6 core principles. One's the energy economic principle, which is, hey, you're a self-organizing system. You got to get calories. You have to avoid destruction, etc. The second is your tendencies will evolve phylogenetically, it's principle evolution. Natural selection is going to build a structure of an investment value system. There's going to be behavioral genetic variation within a population of individual differences for a host of reasons. That's the third principle. There's going to be then computational control structure. There's a neurocognitive computational, the nervous systems and information processing, and then communication system. Then there's a learning system, just the base of it is Skinner. In certain sense, there's an operant structure depending on the consequences and associations. That's old learning language, but it's still decent. And then there's a developmental sequence. Okay. So then you put all that together, you get basically a physically and biologically grounded cognitive behavioral neurodevelopmental systems theory that of animal mental behavior that takes all the key insights and coheres them and says, oh, animals are behavioral investors. And that's a cognitive behavioral neuroscience thing grounded, and it's totally consistent with what's called ethology, the science of animal behavior. It grounds out into virtually all the insights of behaviorism, cognitive neuroscience, et cetera. And it coheres them together and says, oh, here's a meta-theoretical organization that takes Skinner, takes neuroscience, takes cognitive science developments, and ties them together.
And then using the 6 principles, we can build a Cantillian model of the architecture of the mind that ties in memory as well as you do.
Right. Well, so then I utilize that to basically say, what is the layering of behavioral investment? And there's a sensory motor reflex layering that gives rise to a larger operant experiential system that gives rise to a mental manipulation system. And you can see, and other people have made this comment too, you get sort of reacting reflexive animals, and then you get feeling learning animals, and you get thinking animals. Part of the learning and then thinking gives rise to the extension of processing, first in working and then long-term memory. And that affords the capacity to way in which things will model. And then finally, on top of that, you get talking. Okay. So this gives rise to, you get then language, and then humans, that's going to set you up from a primate person jump. So you get this reacting layer, this learning layer, this thinking layer, this talking layer. Okay. And then memory also is part of that structure. And I just take some very standard memory models, Baddeley loop models, and et cetera like that, and say, oh, yep, we can stick this into this structure and show a neurocognitive functional architecture that, again, is optimally gripped in the sense that it teaches you stuff, but it pulls in all conservative knowledge and ties it together and gives you a model that's comprehensive and intelligent.
Right. Do you think that, so I've heard you mention that parts of the joint points might change over time, right? That the evolutionary synthesis, for example, might need to take considerations from what's being learned by the study of complex adaptive systems and so on and so forth. that in itself is very interesting. I want to know more about that. But just in general, like, do you see these models updating over time?
Yeah. I mean, first off, so I'm a scientist. Okay. I am anchored in a correspondent model of truth where we built these models and they get partial truths. I believe in cumulative science, and I do think that we're grabbing a hold of reality in particular ways that does transcend our subjective cultural structures. We can talk about that, but it's limited and it's always going to be changing. And it's, the island metaphor, we expand our island, but the actual space of what we don't know and the new information is going to come in. Okay. And none of the joint points are solidified, really, I would argue. Okay. So obviously I put at the bottom quantum gravity because, like everybody, I'm like, well, and I have good conceptual knowledge, but I'm no physicist. You get general relativity, you get quantum mechanics as a particular relation people don't know. And believe me, in physics, I mean, we have dark energy, muon models. Who the hell knows what's going on there? So that joint point is, I just like to say, hey, between Big Bang and quantum field theory, we can say there's an energy information backdrop to the material complexification. That's all I say. And I think that's solid. I'd be amazed if that is overturned. I mean, that's just basically quantum theory, Big Bang, that's going to hold. Then you get into the natural, modern evolutionary synthesis, where we have unbelievably powerful insights that yoke genetics, especially population genetics, to natural selection. And we bold this together and we can then say, okay, this provides a causal explanatory framework for organismic complexification. And it does. And it's an outline for that. And it's one of the great accomplishments of the 20th century. But there are a lot of issues with it. I mean, really, when you get down to it, in terms of what it can actually explain, in terms of other kinds of things that are happening, like bacteria, they engage in gene swapping. Okay. So like, yeah, the genes leave the bacteria system, jump in. This is how we get CRISPR, by the way. Then they pick it up and they insert genes and all this other shit. So horizontal gene transfer between living structures, that the modern synthesis, it gets fuzzy when you start saying, oh, how the hell does it do that? Okay. There's other things like Lamarckian transmissions of information across generations. Okay. You see that kind of stuff. I've talked to a number of biologists that say, man, the way complexity weaves itself in across generations, it's got a lot more power than natural selection really seems to be able to generate. It seems to be able to find its way into complexified niche structures better than just the mutation kind of structure. There's some sort of complexity building feedback inside the physiological and intergenerational transmission. Okay, that's got a Lamarckian flavor, I believe. All right. And then you go back. So if you start adding this kind of stuff, the modern evolutionary synthesis is just going to, it's going to grow, but it's going to look like Newton to Einstein. Okay. You get in, I mean, behavioral investment theory needs an enormous amount of specification. Okay. It's like, I mean, I got to find out Carl Friston's work and predictive processing. I got to find John Vervaeke's work. I mean, if the evolutionary synthesis, wobbles, well, then I'm built on that. That's going to then wobble. So for me, the issue is all of these systems are outlines that do afford very useful gripping for modeling and afford you an enormous amount to understand that will be part of the cumulative growth. They're not going to be like overturned so that the principle of evolution isn't valid anymore, but it will be updated, refined, shifted so that 50 years from now, things like, yeah, he thought it sort of was that way, be way overemphasize that aspect. And now this was underemphasized, and now we're going to actually really have a much better sense. And then I'll look at it and say, yeah, I was kind of ignorant about that, blah, blah, blah. So that's the picture. The more important thing is, how big a deal quantum gravity and modern evolutionary synthesis are in the world? I'm sitting here going, there's two other fucking joint points, people. there's a whole, there are two theories that are as important as that I happen to stumble upon, me. And like everybody knows about these other two. And it's like, no, there's a life to mind joint point and a mind to culture joint point that we can specify with almost as much coherence if we've just paid attention to it. That should blow the Academy's mind. You'd be like, what? These are the two greatest, accomplishments. You're saying there's another two right here that's just available for apples for us to pick off a tree. It's like, yeah, brother, let's pay attention to that. That's a huge deal. So just the outline of them is super important.
Absolutely. I mean, BIT is really solid. And like you said, Fourier cognition, for example, is very recent and I think on the cusp of really being solidified. And I'm sure it's going to change over the next 50 years. And it's very important to John Vervaeke's work at recursive relevance realization. But what's important is the structure. To say that there are these joint points in this kind of ontological that a way of looking at things that is epistemically clear, that is important, and it's going to be important in guiding those developments in the future.
Totally. Amen. You're singing to the chorus.
Okay, so jumping up a little bit, let's talk about justification hypothesis, the next joint point.
Right. Okay. So this is cool. Just is a really cool. It's my first real novel idea, and then it grounds at that level, grounds everything else. So since if your viewers are familiar with John Vervaeke, we could say, hey, the 4 P's of knowledge. Okay, perspectival, participatory, procedural. I'm going to joke all those, and actually primates do all that. Okay, persons do propositions as well. On top of that, John certainly agrees with that. And then the structure and function of propositional knowledge. Okay, structure and function. Justification, hypothesis, and systems theory gives us a very clear picture of this thing. Okay, it's logically derivable, and then it makes clear evolutionary psychological predictions, novel predictions. Okay, that then feed back and give an enormous amount of credibility, so that essentially the outline of this problem is solved as far as I'm concerned. So what is it? So basically it just says this. Okay, so you have increasingly sophisticated hominids 500,000 years ago who, according to like Michael Tomasello, are able to sync up and generate we spaces. Okay, and meaning that I can read your mind and have a sense of what your intentionality is, and you and I can develop a shared attention and intention about the world, and kids pointing and knowing that there's an intention and a shared attention is a classic archetypal example of what that is. And then we build this. And so now we're hunting mammoth together. We're gathering berries together. Okay. We're sitting around a fire. We're engaged in music. All right. And we're syncing up. And then we get a symbolic tagging ability. Okay. So that we can create an association between a word, a grunt, and a mammoth, okay, and a spear and the fire, all right? So we get a noun verb tagging system, okay, that gives rise to a symbolic shared notion. And then that shifts into a symbolic syntactical notion, okay, whereby we're there antelope gets into there are the antelope. That's the shift from a symbol pairing that gives us intuitive sense to a propositional statement, there are the antelope. Okay, that's a big deal. And when we go propositional, the reason that propositions are really important is because they create a positive assertion about is and ought. There are the antelope. Okay. And what that does then is it's immediately when you can say a proposition that has meaning, it takes up, I like to say, it takes up positive space. Okay. And then what that means also is then negative space is opened up around it. Okay. What's the negative space? All of the things that would threaten the truth of this positive statement, which can be generally framed in is and ought kind of concerns. Like, for example, no, those aren't antelope, those are llama, okay? Or there are no antelope over there, or they were there yesterday. These would be all true statements. And the other is, why ought to I be paying attention to this? There are rabbits over there, there are berries over there, I'm enjoying music over here, okay? So to bring a propositional structure is to say this is truth and we should be paying attention to it relative to other things. Okay, that's implied that we should be paying attention. There ought implications. I'm telling you this because we're going to go hunt them, or we're going to try to corral them or do something, that's relevant to that. And then the issue is, well, wait a minute, maybe not. Okay, on is and ought. All right, so why is that important? Well, the maybe not gets opened up questions. Okay. Questions then are linkages to the negative space in relationship to a proposition. How do you know? What about this? Who knows? Who's saying this, etc. Who? And now let's think about questions. Who? What? When? Why? Okay. Notice how easy those are. It's easy. And hang out with kids. Kids, as soon as they learn propositions, they'll all of a sudden pick up questions, and then they'll shoot out questions. They just because they ain't basically procedural. Why, Dad? Why, Dad? Why, Dad? Shut up, because I said so. Okay. Now, why is all of this important? Well, basically, the proposition, negative space, creates a question-answer dynamic. okay? Whereby to reach equilibrium means you need to build a system of justification, a shared system of justification, which is a propositional network of a shared belief about the world and what we ought to do, okay? So then to gain equilibrium means we have to engage in question answer dialogues to build networks of proposition to describe is and ought, okay? And what that says is it takes language, self-conscious reflection, the emergence of question answer dialogues into the evolution of systems of justification, okay? And that's an actual, now if you go into like, hey, what are some of the key insights of 20th century sociology and philosophy? It's like actually people live in socially constructed systems of justification, okay? Now, many people take the implication of that epistemologically and say, oh, see, science is just one of those, okay? And because of that, hey, it's sociocultural too. UTOK, and through the tree of knowledge, says ontologically, it's an ontological assertion that we are networks of justification builders. Okay, so now the nature of it says it describes what our propositional question answer dialogues are doing. We're engaged in the dynamics of justification, building justification systems, okay, which is a totally different perspective. Now it's not, because everybody's all then trapped by the epistemological implications. Well, how do you know? You're in your culture, I'm in my culture, blah, blah, blah. UTOK comes along and say, yeah, that's what you're all doing ontologically. That's an unbelievably important ontological, not just epistemological, ontological insight. Okay. And it is what makes you operate on a culture, capital C culture, person plane. There's little c, chimpanzees have little c culture, capital C culture, person plane that causes us to rise as persons above our primate existence. And it's living on the justificatory plane. Okay. So what it immediately does is it takes culture in anthropology, gives it a capital C, and then specifies that the organizing glue of human belief value networks are these propositional networks of justification that then live, and people like Bronfenbrenner see this across ecological scales. There are micro little justifications. You and I, when we hook on to a thing in itself podcast, it has a mission, it has a context. If I all of a sudden start talking about my sex life in weird ways, it's like, hey, that's not justifiable. That's not the frame of our little micro context, right? And then this lives in a podcasting world, which lives in a whole other world. And these are macro, meso, micro levels of context of justification that we can specify. So it immediately affords us this big picture view of the structure functional organization. I'm a psychologist. Okay? So what I'm interested in is the much more microscopic, individual and dyadic relational. I'm not so much interested in the large scale histories of justifications, although I am because of very broad knowledge, interest area. But the real interest for me then is, what does this mean about myself and you and my relational world? Okay. What this does is it says, hey, these propositional networks and question answer dynamics open up an entirely new kind of mentation. Okay. That is fundamentally different than the perspectival psyche mentation. Okay. It's different both in terms of its medium, it's propositional instead of perspectival sensory perceptual. But here's the other thing. It is completely intersubjectively available. Okay. Unlike the psyche, okay, which I can't get out of my head, my ego persona goes right through my skin in the same informational form. And I just have people practice that. Say something publicly. Hi, I'm Greg. I'm here to talk to you. And then just say it privately. The informational form doesn't change. Okay, it just goes right through the skin. That's totally different than the experience of red. I can't see your experience of red. What does that mean? It means that it opens up a highway, a mental highway between us to your previously private thoughts. Okay. And that means you now have access to my thinking, which is great when we're on the same page and I can share, hey, we both want to hunt antelope. Okay. But let's say you're a much better rabbit hunter. Okay. And I'm a better antelope hunter. And we're both interested in competition. I mean, we both have status needs that we're barely conscious of. And I come in and say, hey, I found some antelope over there. Immediately, your system is like, okay. But you can't say, well, I don't want to go hunt an antelope because that makes me feel weak. Okay, because that's not going to be justified. Instead, you might say, I saw rabbits over there. We should consider that. Okay. And then I say, well, why? Why don't we go over here? It's like, well, because we got rabbits last time. Now, the justification for why you're doing what you're doing now is available to the community because of the intersubjective highway. Yet, if you think about what your real interests are, this is the Freudian insight, your animalistic self-centered interests can conflict significantly with what's socially acceptable. Okay, right? I mean, just, hey, be cool with every thought you've ever had being unbelievably public on the internet. Are you cool with that? No. Okay. Not really cool with that. And the reason is it reveals aspects of you that are potentially threatened to your reputation. So you have to regulate. So the problem of justification now is, how do I explain what is and ought to be relative to my interests really, and my reputation and social value in the system? Okay, which now is an unbelievably complicated question. Okay, and then we say, well, if evolution designed this, the ego and the persona should be organized to navigate the dynamics in the perspective fields of in the intersubjective persona and the hidden subjective relation, although potentially available, down into the fully contained primate perspective. Okay. So then this gives rise to what's called the updated tripartite model, okay, which is a direct follow from the logic of the problem of justification. And it says you have a primate experiential self. You have an egoic justifier that sits in relation based on what's called the Freudian filter. The Freudian filter is trying to rationalize what it's seeing, i.e. make sense out of, and repress what's potentially threatening. This is a total Freudian, and it does so to manage the persona, okay, in part. And so you then have, in what I call the Freudian filter, and then the Rogerian filter is the persona-ego relation, which is like, we're afraid of other people's judgments, so we're going to regulate. So when you look at human consciousness, you see it as a feeling system, a perceptual system, and it has the self-organized primate system that's tracking its attachment, its status. It's got its egoic propositional justifying self-reflective system and its persona, and it has filtration dynamics between these that are exactly as predicted as to a way nature would design a mental organ of justification to navigate the problem that emerges when you get question-answer dynamics and the need to justify yourself on the social
Right.
stage.
And like you were saying, this is another emergent joint point, because
And there you get, right.
yeah, I mean, exactly, because once you have generative linguistics propositions and shared intentionality in a network of people, then you just can't explain what's going to occur from there using the tools of the model of the animal below it.
Totally. You get an entirely new complex adaptive design mediated by a new information processing communication network. It's tied together through capital C justifications and us as persons rather than primates navigating on justificatory structures. And that is completely embedded in the informational epistemic content and can't possibly be reduced to the energy ontic structures at any physically reductive.
How did John Vervaeke's work come to play a role here in the epistemic categories of justification?
Right. Well, so I get pulled in through rebel wisdom and some challenges that I have in my own department and my own identity, and definitely identifying this meta-modern weird space of postmodern blah blah blah. And then I hear John's 50 lectures on the awakening meaning crisis, and then I find as soon as I heard recursive relevance realization, okay, it was a lock and key function. So I had developed behavioral investment theory just anchors itself on a weak neurocognitive functionalism. What I mean by that is it doesn't take the strong form of computational theory, it takes the weak form of computational theory, specifies what we mean by information processing, and essentially gives rise to initially a predictive processing model like Carl Friston. Okay. But what John's work did with recursive relevance realization, okay, is he brings that, it dives into predictive processing and connects to behavioral investment theory clearly. But what it does is it affords a cognitive and intelligence model that's also very tied to the phenomenology of perspectival participatory procedural consciousness and a transjective engagement in the world, and then gives a much richer articulation, okay, of the dynamics, the complicated iterative dynamics of cognition than I had, okay? So now I can take neurocognitive function and say, oh, it's recursive relevance realization. And it works iteratively with the unified theory in unbelievably cool ways. So for example, you look at the influence matrix, that's another model that emerged, okay? And this is basically modeling the primate heart and the self-other. And it says, hey, we're tracking our social influence and relational value on the dimension of power, love, and freedom, and we're having emotional reactions, okay? Well, what that actually is in John's language is it's a schematic of the fundamental principles of relational change that we're going to be tracking for recursive relevance realization. And now I can take John's and go, oh, when I'm looking at you, I'm engaged, my influence matrix is engaged in tracking recursive relevance realization, whereby we're trying to move ourselves towards social influence, relational value in a mutual space of cooperation. But when we get deviant, then all of a sudden we'll attend to that. And the influence matrix is tracking those systems to realize and protect various affordances. Okay. So it's super cool to then be like, oh, I can now take John's model of cognition, fuse it with my model of social motivation and emotion. And I, as a clinician, I'm more motivation, emotion. John's, of course, more on the cognitive perceptual side of, focused on mentation. But this is just a beautiful then synergy. So to find John's basically key, I had a lock for it, and he just drops a key in there, and it explodes a key aspect of it. Now I often put the V on the behavioral investment architecture. I'm like, really, John's stuff can just fuse right with behavioral investment theory, and we should really think about that as a meta theory of neurocognitive behavior now, because those two systems are really linked together so strongly.
I mean, like, even taking a step back, what's really helpful is that the way that you apply this gives us a definition of cognition, because cognition is really hard to pin down. Like, you can understand the subject matter of cognitive science, but what is cognition is really hard to get down.
Totally. And that's the beauty of, especially I think when you place, I mean, John certainly sees this. Obviously, he's hunting for a synoptic integration of cognitive science. That's part of his whole, he sees the exact same problem in cognitive science as in psychological science, which cognitive breaks off of and really has its history very much and basically defined against behavior, where behavior is defined against mind. Okay, so notice we go and behavior defined against mind, and then cognitive comes back to trying to define against behavior. These are all justification systems. But if you're going to be pulling yourself out and generate a word, cognitive, that is overlapping with artificial intelligence, it's a shit show of confusion about what the hell it means. Okay, and so John's work brings a lot of clarity, most obviously dividing what we mean when we say cognition from a neuroinformation perspective and the functional emergence of that, and what we mean when we say cognition as in to know from more of an epistemological perspective. His four Ps and the model that he affords, and then you put that in the context of the language that UTOK affords on the big systems of behavior and mind in particular. Now I argue we need to define behavior, we can define mind, we can define cognition, consciousness, self, and a whole host of other terms that historically were not going to, they were just mush. And now we can actually have an architecture that defines them.
Okay. Going back to the idea of treating science as a justification system, now using the language that we've developed of a justification system, so it seems to be kind of finding a middle path between the hard modern concept to the postmodern critique, where science is a constructed system, but it just is very good at describing the ontological reality. Is that sort of the argument?
Yeah, so absolutely. So it does to me. So I'm what's called a transcendent realist. Okay. So first, which basically is right along the lines of the thought that was developed by Roy Bhaskar, who's a philosopher of science and developed critical realism. And I didn't know about Bhaskar's work until 15 years ago, certainly after I developed the structure. But actually Bhaskar's critical realism, which is literally critical like postmodern, realism like modernism, is actually specifically a kind of philosophical synthesis that affords us clarity about the ways in which human beings socially get together, and called the four planes of social interaction. They're not exactly like you, but they're similar, tree of knowledge. And then they interact to then build models of the world. And then science affords us a particular structure that does give rise to ontologically justified realist interpretations. Okay. So yes, it's definitely a both and. So I'm basically saying science is not just some pristine, logically, empirically derived entity that is completely removed from human knowing. Definitely not. It's a justification system situated in a socio-historical context. So we can place that, and it's going to carry all those dynamics. However, the entire methods of science, the way in which it's structured in terms of measurement, logical analysis, quantification, and experimental elimination of alternatives in various places, most notably physics, has afforded it the capacity to generate models, okay, that I think when I say transcend human subjective and social knowing, here's what I mean by that. I'm a transcendent realist that says, hey, if we were to find an alien life form that engaged in propositional knowledge about the world and had a model for how the material universe worked, that model would include the four fundamental forces and the particles and atoms, okay? If it has totally different forces that they discovered based on their categories of mind, then I'm wrong. I subscribe to what Roy Bhaskar, I think, makes a case called, he calls it the TINA principle, which stands for there, T, is no alternative. Okay, meaning our analysis of the standard model of elementary particle physics into atoms and the way in which we're able to model behavior across the universe, there's no way that there's a whole nother set of atoms or whatever entities that are really causing events to happen. There's just no alternative. That's the argument. So if it were the case that another alien system we encountered, they would come and we say, hey, what's your model of material universe? The models would align. And if completely different knowing systems build identical models about the structure, then you can argue your ontology of the ontic. The ontic is the word for what's real. Ontology is our theory of that. Our ontology is not epistemologically derived or dependent, but is actually independent of just our knowing structures. We can transcend our knowing structures to yield if a whole nother epistemic system that's completely independent gets the same picture. Well, that's a realist justification. And that's what I mean. I'm a transcendent realism when it comes to things like the standard theory of elementary particle physics and our atomic theory of matter.
Right. The ontic would still be the same.
Yep. So but I'm the Kantian idealist may be right. Maybe they have a totally different system, and then I'll be humbled by that. And then it will be more than the postmodern critique and the idealist epistemological critique would hold, and I would be wrong. But that's where I am in relationship.
It would destroy my brain. It would blow up my mind if that would happen.
Yeah, it would. Right. Right. My whole system, I would be very humbled by it. It would be weird. And so anyway, but that's where I am. I don't see how that's even possible myself, but I'm always open to new things.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, the meat of it is that there'll always be historical contingencies in our practice of science, right? Like that. There's no way to avoid that.
No, but we did do something special with the epistemology of science, and the cumulative nature of that project and the way it's unfolded, to me, makes me, certainly for the physical sciences, transcendent realist. I think we can, UTOK and in UTOK then comes along and says, yeah, actually, we start to build. Obviously, it's too isolated. We need a lot more people eyes on this from a lot more different perspectives of justification for me I have confidence because I'm inside it of what, the tree of knowledge in UTOK does for us. But I think we can achieve that. I think because then you get continuity. And then if there's grounded continuity, you get an emergent transcendent realist picture across the whole structure.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the way of achieving that is exactly what you're doing, right? Like having conversation with people, trying to elucidate this, making sure that people are conscious of how they're operating in their fields, and gaining greater ontic clarity is the way to do that.
Yeah, totally. And to me, I just do encourage everybody. Yeah, the grammar. Go out there, matter, mind. No, don't do that. It's energy, matter, like, mind, culture.
Right.
And you do that, and all of a sudden, what seems to be an impossible puzzle becomes a lot more.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is not just a system to learn once; it's a language to learn how to speak.
You talking now?
Yeah, I did a podcast with James Robert Brown, and he wrote a book on the science force and just a history of that from the perspective of mathematics. And at the end of it, he brought up a really good point that stuck with me, was that what where those discussions have moved today from they were from say from what was the higher superstition book in that time.
Sure. 1994.
1994, thank you. From there to today is that people are no longer criticizing like the fact of science. Postmodernists are no longer criticizing the fact of science or the enterprise of it. They're criticizing the institutions, and that's important. Like we need to make sure that people have access to institutions, and we're getting diverse perspectives, and getting a greater probability of success and change in academia. That's probably a better place to put criticism than the actual on-tick value of science as a justification system.
Totally. Absolutely. And that is right. And there's always been a fuzzy line. And of course, many postmodern and modernists, virtually all modernists agree. Yes, a lot of forces go into what gets funded, of course, and how things get framed, and that enormous shaping. The whole peer review is obviously at some level, contextualized by people's paradigms and all of this other stuff. So you have to have a postmodern critique, in my estimation. The real best postmodern critique, which we can now transcend from a UTOK perspective, is there's no worldview. There's no usable worldview in science. And you need a worldview, although they're anti any grand narrative. Social, historical, contextual living requires language game worldviews. Okay. And since science really doesn't have one, we're going to be very careful about taking facts and then jumping those facts into worldviews that are going to have consequences. And the facts, although you can isolate them and define what they mean in particular relation, they sit in different worldviews in different ways. And since science lacks a worldview, we need to be very skeptical of that. Okay. And to me, UTOK then comes along and say, yeah, it lacked a worldview. Okay. but now, all right, now we actually have a worldview that takes the critique of postmodernism and ontologically validates it. And then situates the whole thing in a new picture theory that's like, actually now, this is a transcendent, so we'll set the stage down the road for a transcendent worldview, which I believe we need in the new global age and how everything's changing. And we actually need a grip, an optimal grip on reality and our place in it. And man, we definitely don't have that. And if we can actually get that, maybe that will help.
I really like John Vervaake's terminology for this cultural cognitive grammar. That science and philosophy have to be general. That's our great ambition. But you can't ignore history. You can't ignore cultural development, especially when you're dealing with life in mind.
Totally. And in fact, I'm so on board with that. I will now. I just released a video, UTOK 20, in the enlightenment gap. I am saying, hey, people say, oh, you're saying that UTOK is everything. No. Okay. I want to be very clear. I'm actually situated in a particular cultural grammar. Okay. UTOK doesn't have a lot of relevance if you're in Chinese, philosophy 300 years ago, or Aristotle. I wouldn't come to Aristotle and be like, hey, there are 4 dimensions. Aristotle, the entire Aristotle frame is that there are 4 dimensions, right? I'm situated in a particular socio-historical context that gave rise to a particular grammar. Okay. And that grammar then has a crucial role in creating then a chaotic fragmented pluralism that gives rise to a meaning and mental health crisis that John is so clear in his articulation of. This is about grabbing the grammar. It's about knowing you come from a grammar. Of course, if you understand justification systems, you realize, systems are always then really emerging in relationship to other systems. They're always, the energy to justify is always placed in the context of previous systems of justification. So there's an evolutionary history there. So then you should identify as a postmodern language game insight. Oh, I'm playing a language game as a function. And my argument is, and we can transcend that if we have the right tools. And that's amazing.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the bittersweet part of doing this, right? That we're constrained by our history, or our place in history. Like, I spent a lot of time on Hegel, and so when I see your system, it's just ringing to my ears. But I can't put those in dialogue, just because that's lost. Like you said, the Hegelian system doesn't go away. I don't want to be too strong with that. But the developmental trajectories of these different fields are just too different. That if you want to connect them, you're going to have to go and build the language from top to bottom, rather than find something that already exists. Yeah. Okay. Shifting gears a bit, I want to talk about depression. So you had a little chapter of the book dedicated to applying piety to understanding the behavioral shutdown model of depression. Could you talk about that a bit?
UTOK it gives rise to a totally new way of doing psychology, okay, which I now, in my recent book, I'm really delineating. It's called mental behaviorism. And then what that says is, hey, we should be clear that our constructs are very fuzzy based on the structure, the epistemological structure, almost anti-ontological structure. So it makes that prediction. And then it makes the prediction that if you take a UTOK lens, we can see that fuzziness and then pull a through line through constructs, tie them together, and then have much more clarity about their ontology. So I just want to make that as a general point. A lot of the dissertations that I supervise in my doctoral for my doc students are about that. So we have done this with dreams. We've done this with interpersonal violence. Okay. We just did it with borderline personality disorder. We just did it with psychological mindfulness. All right. So there's a method here that says, hey, you can assimilate and integrate key concepts. All right. The first concept I ever did was depression. Okay. So now we ask, what is depression? In fact, I'm going to put out a little video on what Jordan Peterson gets right and wrong about depression. Okay. And actually he's a great person to go to in this regard. I mean, not without getting entangled. He's a good theoretical clinical psychologist. Okay. And if you listen to him, he's like, hey, you got a dopamine structure. There's weird stuff going on with serotonin. There's an evolutionary status dynamic. There's all sorts of biomedical stuff that can go wrong and influence it. There's also shit that happens in your problems and living. And it's really just this sort of cluster. And what we call depression is really funky. And then he gets all hesitant. Okay. And that's right in terms of, that's a nice articulation of where we are and the various facets. What's wrong is just the ontology. Our ontology is all off. Okay. The reason our ontology is all off, A, problem of psychology, and then B, the way we try to apply the world, where basically depression is situated in a medical context, psychiatry, which then looks at the world in terms of distress and dysfunction and then disease, and then affords us this idea that, oh, depression as part of a medical complex must be a disease, meaning implying that there's broken biology in its cause. Okay. And then so when you grab a hold of depression as having potentially broken biology, which by the way, I think there's some probably do, but also is much more than that in many cases doesn't, then you get this confusion. And this is what Jordan Peterson really gets. Do we diagnose, if you live under a bridge as a homeless person and are miserable, and then you score high in depression, are you depressed? Well, I did studies on what psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, no one agrees on that basic question. Why not? Because some people are walking around with the biological, ideological model and meaning, oh, well, if you have obvious problems in living, okay, that cause the sadness, then obviously that's just normal sadness. In fact, there's a bereavement exemption always been. If you're just lost your child 3 weeks ago and you can't sleep and you're crying all the time and your own life has any meaning, we're going to slap a depression diagnosis on you. Okay. And they don't. But it's also the case, what if you're homeless? Well, they do act. There's no homeless. Okay. So anyway, there's this unbelievable cluster of confusion because we don't know. Medicine needs a way to categorize it. It sort of does and sort of doesn't. Okay. And that's just that's a diagnosis of all the confusion. UTOK comes along with behavioral investment theory and says, oh, depression is a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Okay. That's what it is. And now so many people listen, of course that's what it is. I was like, yeah, okay. Only now is it, of course, what it is. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you take the logic of behavioral investment, okay, means that say you have energy, desire, and drive, you're going to expend it towards particular work effort to get a return on that effort. Okay. If you fail to get the return on the investment, you're going to get frustration and energize yourself more. Okay. If you can't avoid pain, you're going to get anxious and you're going to try to avoid more. If frustration and anxiety do not alleviate, okay, do not alleviate the problem, the next best thing you do is you give up and emotionally hibernate and hope that it passes. And ideally, you're actually situated in a network of relations that says, hey, I am sick. and I need to shut down, help me. So it's actually a communicative structure for social primates to say, come take care of me. Other animals will just go hibernate. Okay. So what am I saying? I'm saying, oh, its system shuts down. Okay. By design. Well, then how does it do that? Well, actually, the way you would shut a behavioral system down at its core is that you jack up the negative affect system and its reactivity so that it's identifying threat and problems high. And what the key of depression is an anhedonia. You pull down the desire approach pleasure system so that it's no longer even seeing possibilities for investment. It's just going to sit on seeing possibilities for threat and hibernate while hopefully the system goes over, because you've already done frustration and anxiety. Okay. And so then the system downgrades itself into, you are psychologically sick. By the way, depression is essentially a organism to animal sick mode. Okay. That says there's no good and passive investment for you to be taken care of. Shut down, send some signals that you're in trouble. Okay. And then sit. And so you don't feel like doing shit. You feel like shit because it's a bad scenario. You don't feel like doing shit because especially the initiation of behavioral activity gets undercut by depression. So depression turns off the initiation switch. That's why it's so hard to get out of bed, so hard to start stuff when you're depressed. It causes you to anticipate problems and things. So you see things as pointless. You feel helpless. You feel hopeless. The justification system goes right on this and starts an iterative ruminative process. Okay. So now you look at all the symptoms of depression. First off, there's a biological shift. Normally, you get hypersomnia, more sleeping, less eating. Interestingly, those things can be disrupted. Depends on the situation, depends on the person. You get fatigue. All depression has to have either the jack up of the negative affect system or the pull down of anhedonia. Virtually all of them have both. This is the epicenter. Okay. So you get all of the symptoms now being organized functionally by this really simple description. Okay. And then you put it in an animal mental behavioral context and you're like, well, what causes shutdown? Well, then you have three broad categories immediately present themselves. Okay. One is the shit of the world that Jordan Peterson would talk about. And I would talk about like if I was on the train to Auschwitz, okay, train to Auschwitz, you're fucking depressed. I mean, you're just muted probably and just can't believe it and in denial. And what else are you doing? And the reason is the entire system now is collapsed. Your entire system of behavioral investment is taken away from you. And you are now on the path to full-fledged suffering with nothing you can do about it. That if you take an inventory, a Beck depression inventory on the train of Auschwitz, the average score is going to be in the depressed range. And we're not going to give diagnoses to these people. This is what's called a depressive reaction. If your kid dies, okay? And I would argue if your entire life starts imploding because you have alcohol problems, you can't get a job, you end up homeless. I mean, come on. Right? You end up in prison. There are a lot of things that can constrain and create a depressive reaction, what I call, which is in line with the problems of living and makes perfect sense that you're shutting down. This is why, the way, so many people wouldn't diagnose a homeless person because it makes perfect sense. Okay. We should just have a classification that says, I think this is a depressive reaction where the shutdown is in line with the developmental difficulties that this person has. It's okay. We are complicated biological creatures, okay? You can get strokes, for example, mini strokes, all right? Mini strokes and other kinds of things can cause that positive and negative affect system to get broken in particular ways. There are things that give rise to what I would call depressive diseases, okay? The biologic can break. And there are some cases that are so pervasive where it's like, oh my God, I think this entire system is essentially shifted into what I would call a melancholic depression that can only really be best explained in the culture and the family or whatever. This person is in a place of melancholic depression. That's a depressive disease. Okay, so now we have and historically you have reactive and endo, and this depressive disease would be endo, meaning within the person, reactive meaning to what's going on. There's another category that's most obvious, what I call neurotic depressions. Okay. Now, neurotic depressions emerge when the behavioral investment, influence matrix, and justification systems in the biological primate organism are behaving totally normally, but they are behaving maladaptively, okay? That creates a reciprocal narrowing, to use John's term, and dead ends you into the world. And I see this all the time in the clinic room, Okay. So how does this work? People get injured. Okay. They have negative reactions to the negative feelings, and then they bring coping that makes shit a lot worse. This happens all the time. Okay. And the coping, I like to say, is like, it's like water on a grease fire. Okay. And then the water on the grease fire causes things to spread. So what's an example? So you get a depressive individual, okay, who comes in, I hope that my adjustment to college is going to go well. Okay. And I better do it, because, and then they get there and they try to go to a party and they talk awkwardly to somebody, and the first midterm comes back a C. And by the time they're 6 to 8 weeks in college, they're like, this had to have gone well. What the hell is wrong with me? This sucks. I'm never going to be able to adjust. Okay. Notice, so now you're in a negative situation, you get negative feelings, and then the system, the justificatory system, goes haywire on it. Okay. And then that causes the feeling system to be like, oh my God, this is fucking hopeless. And so then it gets all withdrawn, and the system is like, now I'm ineffective. I can't even go to class. What the hell's wrong with me? So now the blaming system is now piling on to a shutting down system, and you get what's called a depressive disorder, where the justification system is being hijacked in a pessimistic way, creating self-blame, turning against the self, as the felt primate system is now like, I can't get anybody to take care of me, and my rider, the ego on top of my horse, hates me. So now I'm just a helpless fucking child, and so I'm doing nothing but sitting in bed. So now you get the ego at war with the experiential self, okay, which is the central cognitive insight of the pessimistic, helpless learner. And then the system itself is getting just this iterative process. So that's an example of the different domains of systems. And by the way, our current society is totally set up in a bad way that makes this very likely to happen. Okay. So you get, and that's why we're seeing massive increases in anxiety and depressive disorders for a whole host of reasons I could get into. So essentially, bottom line, what's depression? So we should describe it as a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Makes perfect sense if you understand behavioral investment theory and the way organisms, animals, and primates act in the world, and the way our structure is. That is what description, we can then ask, what gives rise to the shutdown? What kinds of developmental environmental structures? What kinds of agent arena adaptive structures or maladaptive structures? And what is the biophysiological architecture, and where is it in relationship to this? And you get depressive diseases, depressive disorders, depressive reactions. And you're like, oh, that's what depression is. Okay. And it just makes perfect sense. And my last thing I'll say is, like, I'm passionate about this. We talk about meaning mental health crisis. The depression is the #1 cause in the world of disability. Okay. It's the #1 cause of disability. So, and we don't even know what it is. We can look at Jordan Peterson, take his clips and be like, okay, guys, so what is it? Well, it's this complicated possible thing, blah, blah, blah. It's like, if you have the right, it's a state of behavioral shutdown. Oh, it has reactive structures. It has maladaptive elements. It's got biophysiological elements. Makes perfect sense. It's amazing then that this #1 cause of disability is so confused. And it's just an example of why the problem of psychology is so important.
Well, I mean, that's probably why treatment but diagnosis is so difficult, right? That there are lots of different paths to behavioral shutdown. There's lots of different ways in which negative affect can increase, and desire and motivation can decrease. Like you said, like, you can be struck by lightning, and if you're struck by lightning, your negative affect is going to go up right away in the flash of a second. Or you can be exposed to terrible socioeconomic, political situations, and the rate of change there will probably be different. Maybe there'll be reciprocal dynamics, like John points out, and then there are all these different paths.
Right. And you want to know, in terms of institution, postmodern critique, what we did was we decided that there were natural non-human causes to the world, and we call that medicine. And medicine then is different because we don't hold you responsible. Once we diagnose you medically, that means it's operating at the living organism plane and mechanistically causing shit, and your culture person plane's not responsible. Okay. So then we grant psychiatry, which is a medical discipline, diagnosing all of these things, which then means institutionally, you have to decide whether this is not the person's fault at all and caused completely independently of who they are, and reduces to biological breakdown, or is then caused by who they are and problems in living, and then is not a medical problem at all. Notice then the institutional categories preordain an inability to define what the hell the thing is, because it doesn't reside in those kind of categories that we built based on the error of the Enlightenment gap, where we thought, oh, there's matter and biology, and then there's mind out here. That these two totally different things, and there's no, it's either or, and of course it's not either or at all. But there you go. That's part of the history as to why you're sort of like, so the institution of postmodern institution is actually broken. It's already given the authority to define the thing by an institution that has to define the thing as a disease. It's a preordained, like where we got troubles,
I mean, like,
So, anyway.
just from a popular perspective, I think the way that people think about medicine is just that there's a mechanism in your body that's working, it breaks, you have to fix or replace it. Like, it's like a car. There's a part in your car that breaks, you got to fix or replace it. There's just no way to apply that beyond the life plate. You can't think of mental mechanisms the same way.
Absolutely. We do it with ADHD. We do it. I mean, this is the way in which our mental illness models then are applying are creating so much sickness and confusion at just an epistemic level of like what we are, who we are. And again, that's why the problem of psychology is so unbelievably important, is because the academy hasn't given lay people a proper model just for sense making. It creates this division of, well, that's not you at all. That's your ADHD. It's like, I mean, in nonsense in relationship to those claims is just astronomical. Yet the institution is structured to behave that way, and it's tragic.
Yeah, really is. Because as you said, it's such an important problem, and it'll continue to be likely into the future.
And that we're seeing rates of opioid use, suicide, adolescent anxiety shooting through the roof, folks. This is not going away. And the number of people that are suffering because of a misalignment of how they understand themselves in the world is just makes me want to weep.
Yeah, it's brutal. Okay, shifting to something a little bit more optimistic, hopefully. The fifth joint point. The idea of what's next at the.
You said optimistic. Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. We certainly can go with optimism. It depends on where you catch me, and especially if I'm talking about depression, I got semantic associative network of disaster already. Anyway, yeah, I'm certainly a little scared about what's going to happen. But let's talk a little bit about the fifth joint point. So, if you look at the tree of knowledge, all right, as it did within 6 months at least, the tree of knowledge, where I saw, okay, matter, life comes out of matter, mind comes out of life, culture comes out of mind. Hey, what will be next? Once it dawned on me, okay, that each one of these fields, planes of existence, are organized by novel information processing communication networks. Okay, you don't have to be a genius to basically like, are we seeing the emergence of novel information processing communication networks in the 20th? And so the 20th century now looks very much like, so mind in the tree of knowledge frame is mindedness, animal mindedness. And basically you get about 700 million years ago, you get sponges and and things like, flatworms, but they don't have centralized brains, and they're not complex active systems. More or less complex active body systems comes along the Cambrian explosion, okay? And although they're going to find more shit around this, but basically between 560 to 520 million years ago, really down into some places, you can argue almost 2 million years, you see an explosion of the animal kingdom, okay? With its complex active bodies, almost certainly because you get prey-predation relation, and then that creates an arms race of sensory motor structures that are eating each other. And then that arms race gives rise to the basic animal body plan. Okay. So you have jellyfish that are like networked, but not centralized, and they're not coordinated. And then all of a sudden there's a press happens, and then they get centralized, and you get animals with complex active bodies and centralized nervous systems. So I look out at the 20th century and I see the jellyfish model. Okay. We're laying down an internet. We have independent artificial intelligence structures, okay, computational structures, and we're getting communication networks, phones, okay? And now the networking of that is building in more and more intensely, and it's building in a way that's an interfacing with us and the world of things, the rest of the world of things, with greater and greater intimacy and greater fluidity and power, okay? And that's when the 21st century really is essentially the idea is that this thing at the tech level, this thing is going to again get solidified, and create the opportunity for another complex adaptive plane of existence, the digital plane. Okay. Well, this is like nothing that's ever happened before. So we built a material culture. Tree of Knowledge defines society as 4 fundamental things. You're situated in a biophysical ecology. You're animal primates that are engaged in work effort, behavioral investment patterns. You then have capital C culture, and then you have technology. Okay. Historically, technology was not information interfacing with language or anything else, but now it is. That's what 20th century did. And then now it's in networking everything else together. So what this is doing is it's giving us both a great hope and a great terror. Okay. The great hope is, oh my God, the power of this, okay, and the opportunities for this. And then the great terror is like, oh my God, the power and the chaos. Okay. The chaos means all the old institutions are situated in a kind of information processing communication network that assumes all of these kinds of things that are now not valid anymore because you can operate in a totally different dimension. Okay. Of course, it also affords all sorts of different kinds of powers. Oh my God, I can neural link myself in information interface with the internet and have that kind of speed in my understanding. You can be like, oh my God, that's great. And like, oh my God, that's horrible. Okay. So to me, the 5th joint point at its most concrete level is basically, okay, the digital is happening. And everything that tells us that's going to wobble, cause all sorts of things to wobble. Okay. We got to evolve through it. And then the question is how. All right. Now, if everything in the world was going fine, this would be a big challenge, but I wouldn't be super freaked out about it. But you may have noticed that not everything in the world is going fine across all sorts of different institutional, ecological structures, mental health structures, meaning-making structures, etc. So we got this digital evolution as the emergence of modernity and the Anthropocene now is endangering / killing the planet, depending on what the arc of time you're looking at and who you're reading. And you have all of this globalization network, and you have all this flux in what people believe, and really the breakdown in belief structures into a chaotic, fragmented pluralism on economic generator systems that need to keep growing, but can't keep growing in relationship to the demand they put on everything. You get a really, really dangerous intersection. Okay. And so that's what makes me scared. If I go back to the depression, let's go optimism. Like, oh God, we could get global civilization collapse. Okay. The 5th joint point from UTOK is really a call. And what it says is we're both in danger and there's a great opportunity here. Okay. And what the 5th joint point says is from a UTOK, this is very UTOK centric. Okay. But, and I want to be clear, there are a lot of different kinds of pieces that could be woven in. But if I stay within UTOK, it says, hey, if we're going to make it through the thread of the needle of the 5th joint point, which is come through the cone and have it organized in a way that maintains the sustainability, coherence, and integrity as best as possible of the entire stack across the various dimensions of life, the ecology of the planet, mental animals, which we've already brutalized, but could do better on, and the rest of human population, we better have it cohere, the emergence of the digital, and get sustainability with all of this high stacked vulnerability. How the fuck are we going to do that? Okay. Well, UTOK comes along and says, actually, it affords us an optimistic statement by saying, well, one of the reasons that we're in so much confusion is because our knowledge systems are broken. Okay. I mean, we're flying blind coherently. So we are essentially clueless in our capacity to understand the world and our place in it, meaning there's no operating system that is coherent. Okay. And that can explain why there's so much confusion, at least in part, and why we're in such a dangerous plot. And then, of course, UTOK comes along and is like, well, actually, it's the first real clued in coherent system. It's not the end, it's the beginning of being clued in. Okay. And if you can get then a global knowledge system that is in line with science, but also orients the psyche and then collective wisdom, okay, and does so in a coherent integrated play, we can pull the wisdom from the various traditions now and create a tapestry of various insights that allow a coherent, meaningful system that manages mental growth effectively, or health effectively, and then does so in a way that can possibly guide us to interface with the planet, with ourselves and each other, and with the emerging digital, so that we're oriented toward wisdom and grounded in knowledge that's going to be cumulative. And if we can do that, then you have an actually operative selective function. Each one of the dimensions has a selective function like justification on the symbol, okay, justification systems process. So you get UTOK, it's grandiose or whatever, but UTOK then becomes what I call the digital identity solution, okay, especially through the coin and the what I call the I-quad correction, which is like our psyche, science, wisdom function can get rotated and can get correctly placed in the cosmos, so we understand our cosmic coordinates knowledge-wise, and we understand our valued states of being future-wise. And if everybody could upgrade to having right relation to is and ought, we might actually be able to create what Daniel Schmachtenberger and others call the third attractor. Okay, he argues that actually, if we look, he's a global civilization collapse risk guy, and he's like, oh my God, we're either going to blow everything up chaotically, or as that happens, we're going to create a 1984 totalitarian structure. These are the two dystopian attractors that are obvious. We need a third attractor. UTOK comes along and says, well, a key point about the third attractor is our knowledge systems. It diagnoses why our knowledge systems have been so broken. So that's one thing that other systems don't do. And then it's from that diagnosis that it clarifies the proper correction and then gives rise to a coherent system so that we go from being clueless to having a clue.
It's so tough because, I mean, this is the kind of solution that we need, the proposal that we need when developing AGI systems. But you're right. I mean, the state of the world seems really frightful. Like, AGI systems are controlled. If anyone's going to win that race, it's going to be one of the major corporations. I think there's no way around that.
Totally. Right. And the people that are then raised, I mean, all due respect, but the Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg's and whatever, they're raised in a particular structure, okay, and they're going to have they're going to be actually architecturally built in a particular way. We need a different kind of philosophical, scientific, humanistic perspective that's going to inform the structures of growth across time in ways that actually have deep meta values. And that's one of the nice things about being a clinical psychologist who's philosophically informed. Like, no, I got a frame on this.
I mean, honestly, I'd even put it more stronger than that, like, the personality of the people at the behest of this is important. But at the end of the day, I think what's more important is just the economic constraints that act on them.
Well, that's one of the great real challenges, is that all, as Daniel Schmachtenberger talked about, the incentive generative functions are in play right now, that are the momentum and the infrastructure. And this is really sad and scary. So for me, I mean, I grow up, you're giving place it in one context about why this is so difficult. I'm embedded in the institution of psychology. Okay. I mean, I get, my doctoral training, and my advisor's a good person. He's pretty well networked. I go work with Beck. I get connected with people. I do all this other, but the message that I bring to bear to the institution is not something the institution's interested in. Okay. And as a function of that, nobody really cares. For 25 years, I've had one-on-one wonderful conversations, but the collective institution cannot stop what it's doing and then start to upgrade based on a set of ideas, because the institution incentives are to get grants. I mean, when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, just to give you an idea of institutional incentives, I had to put the Tree of Knowledge and the Theoretical Unification publication, which is in Review of General Psychology, at the back of my Vita, because it wasn't an empirical it wasn't data-based. Okay. Yet when I'd done surveys on what practitioners thought of borderline personality disorder, that was right in the front, because that had numbers in it. Okay. Because we're an empirical enterprise. And you're just sort of, in retrospect, so now you look at corporations and you're like, oh my God, our obligation is to get growth for our shareholders and our employees. And that's what we do. And anything that pulls out of that then threatens the entire justificatory narrative. And if you're paid to think that way, and the entire institutions, the momentum and inertia is scary as fuck. There's no doubt about it. And how are we going to actually undo that and create other generative mechanisms? I love Daniel Schmachtenberger's thought on this. And I'm ignorant about the actual, I'm a theorist, I just dove deep into abstraction, pulled out my rabbit's hole, the right analytics and logos. And we'll have to figure out how people market this, how people that get actually invested in it, and how to actually use it as agents of change. I'm going to need serious help on that. That's not my forte, but anyway. So, we'll see. My mission, I just finished my book, and my mission is try to help make UTOK accessible. The nice thing about UTOK, we talk about behavioral shutdown, there are other pieces. There are a huge bunch of, straightforward applications that can help people improve pretty much right off the, dust it off and like this thing called ComMemo and other kinds of things. So my hope is to sort of like help people see its utility, get a bunch of seers together who got various aspects and start to stitch our visions together and hopefully figure out a way to consolidate that into a message that can be clear enough in time for enough people to wake up and really start the hard work of shifting the institutional inertia into something else. That's what else can we do? So